grab a beer if you don't have one yet. There's some in the back there. You can scan this QR code or go to the website and fill out a quick true to brand sensory form.
18. All right, we'll give you all another 2 minutes or so, and then we'll just kind of show the data here and show how simple Google Forms is to use. I mean, we can go through it. So it was almost too simple to create, to share. I mean, I could.
We'll show you
We
how.
could maybe during the Q&A, I could just do it. It literally took me 3 minutes. Okay, I'm gonna just share the. Come on, baby. The form here. So this is the form. We have 27 responses. As you all saw this form, pass, fail on these attributes for Ranch Hazy IPA, brewed by Industrial Arts, Beacon, New York. And here are the responses. We got 1 fail on aroma. 30,
All the same.
29 passes on visual, 29 passes on aroma, overall pass. This is just an example of a very basic, true to type sensory panel. So y'all just conducted a sensory panel. And like the point of this presentation is kind of to show how simple it can be to just get started collecting data. And with that, I mean, you're welcome to finish y'all's beer. Latecomer, you're gonna miss a panel, sorry. Don't have your data. But yes, this is basically on starting a true to type sensory panel. I'm Geoff Wenzel from Industrial Arts.
I'm Amy Todd from Diagnostics.
And we're just gonna kind of go over some things we've done in the past to start true to type sensory panels at our respective breweries or companies to hopefully help you all do the same if you're not doing it already. And if you are, hopefully we can teach you something as well, or you could teach us something. I don't know.
All right, you want me to do the?
Yeah, you can go
So
through this.
yeah, we kind of changed our order of things last minute, and we didn't want you guys to have to wait to drink your beer, so we started with that right away. Yeah, the whole point of this is just to show you that starting a sensory panel does not have to be complicated or intimidating. You all just did the first step here. That's how easy it can be. We're going to go through, we're going to introduce ourselves a little bit more detail. We're going to go through our program evolution, so kind of how we got started with our sensory panels, mistakes we made, challenges we went through, and how we changed as our programs evolved, as our breweries evolved. We'll get into a little bit about why to start a sensory panel, some goals you might want to pick when starting your panel to kind of help you keep that going and be successful with that, how to actually set up the panel. We'll get into a little bit of training, and then we'll go over building a Google form, which you just saw, and we already evaluated the beer, so you won't.
Oh, right, we didn't switch that. The evaluation, we
That's
moved that to the front. Yeah, whatever. You get it. That's me. A little bit about my history in the beer industry. I was a GM at Keegan Ales. I worked there for 12 years, started brewing in 2003. Then I moved to Colorado, learned a lot of sensory through their sensory program, which is really well done. Learned a lot from Lindsay Barr, who presented here a bunch. And kind of took that information and brought it to my new role as the research and development brewer at Industrial Arts and started the sensory program there. And yeah, we'll go over a little bit about that stuff today, more specifically building true to type descriptions for your respective breweries' beers.
And I'm Amy. I'm laboratory scientist at Diagnostics. Geoff comes from the brewing side. I kind of come from more of the quality control side. So first got into chemistry, went into the lab at a couple of breweries, ran the lab at Magic Hat, Zero Gravity, started the sensory programs there as well. I started Zymology Labs in 2016, which is a beer testing lab that I sold to Diagnostics. So now there is also cannabis and food allergen testing to add to the beer. Certified Cicerone, BJCP judge, and on a couple committees in the Vermont Brewers Association. So yeah, just kind of getting into our sensory programs, how they kind of changed, and different things that we've done there. So I no longer run a sensory panel, but for several years I was at Zero Gravity and running that sensory panel. You know, you can use the best ingredients available. You can follow your recipes exactly. You can hit all of your target numbers and yet still have some sort of off flavor in your beer. Or maybe it's not an off flavor, but maybe the beer is just not quite true to type or true to brand. So a lot of sensory panels, we're kind of focusing today on true to type sensory panels, so making sure that you're hitting those consistent flavor profiles. And you know, you can certainly get expensive lab equipment that can isolate individual flavor compounds, but that doesn't necessarily tell you how those flavors are interacting with each other or if the beer is palatable or not. So the best way for a small craft brewer to do that is to have a trained sensory panel. And that's what we're going to be getting into today. So when we first started at Zero Gravity, we did a group format, group setting. So we would have 2 sessions, 10, 10:30 in the morning, back to back, same thing, so that brewers could swap out. So we do this 2 days a week. So we didn't have to shut down production line. Nobody had to stop brewing. People could just swap out, and made it easier for everyone to attend. My biggest struggle with sensory was always getting people to come, which I guess is a good thing, that everybody wants to work hard instead of drinking beer at 10 in the morning. But I would often be tracking down folks to attend. So our group format, so we were using Google Forms at the time. People would come, have their beer, sample it, and evaluate it on their own. So you first want to evaluate the beer individually without talking to anybody, fill out your form, submit your data, and then after that we would talk about it as a group. So you don't want to be talking about it because we are very easily influenced by what other people say. If I were to hand you a beer and say, this beer tastes really funny, what do you think? You're going to look for something that smells funny or out of the ordinary, and you might find something whether it's actually there or not, because we are just looking for something. So also in group settings, sometimes you have very dominant personalities that might be overpowering the group and swaying things in a certain direction. You might have the brewer on your panel and you don't want to say anything bad about the beer if there is something that you don't like about it, which we'll get into, I guess, liking, and that's a whole, I'm probably going to get into
Well, brewers never do that.
So that worked well for us because we were just starting, and so a lot of times people aren't very confident in their sensory skills or their tasting skills. So especially if you haven't done this before, you might not feel, I certainly had, I think that was one of the things with getting people to come, because they, were like, oh, I don't want like my opinion about the beer to affect, the whole brewery. But the more data you have, the better it is, the easier it is to make decisions about that beer. So yeah, that was good for getting started. One of the big drawbacks to that was it took a long time. So it would be about a half hour. We would try to limit it to about 4 beers. After that, you're starting to get into palate fatigue and your data's not going to be as good. So it would take longer sometimes. Sometimes people would come in late and then they would either have to skip, or it would just take longer. Then when the second group was coming, that would take longer. So we eventually moved to a more individualized format. So we would have sensory open from 10 to 11. People could come in, get their flight, fill out their forms, and then go back to whatever they were doing. So that offered more flexibility for people. Whatever they were doing, they could come in. It was a lot quicker. At this point, we had changed our form, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. So this was about 10 minutes. Some of the drawbacks to this were I didn't want to necessarily have beer sitting out for like a half hour. So if I was prepping 4 flights of beer, I didn't want it to sit out for a half hour. So I would tend to do maybe 2 or 3 flights at a time as people would come in. Sometimes the packaging line would just shut down and they would all come at the same time. So then I would have to prep 5 or 6 all at once. So, certainly have pros and cons. Big part of what we're going to talk about today is just everything's, every brewery is different. You got to find what works for you and go with that. So, the group setting started great for us, and then eventually once people were more confident in our brands and just used to coming in and evaluating beers, that individual format worked better for us. Now, getting into a lot of my mistakes was the format that we first had with our Google Forms. We had scales, and then we also had sections where you could click, pick different attributes of a beer. So we didn't quite have very thorough descriptions of the beers when we first started, and I think part of our process was just that we would kind of gather that data as we were starting out. So we would have, 1 to 5 scale for turbidity, for hop intensity, malt sweetness, and then we would have check boxes for like malt flavor. So is it honey, doughy, cracker? Some of the challenges were this, I just told you, you're very easily influenced by what you see. So if you're filling out that malt flavor and you see, I guess I'm kind of getting some honey on this beer, and you click that, and then next time you're like, I said honey last time, and so I'm getting this, and before you know it, you are just associating that flavor with that beer, and always clicking it, whether you necessarily are getting it or not. The problem with the scales was that we had not really trained on what that scale meant. So I would get, half the people would say our lager had a hop intensity of 3, and another half that said our IPA was also a 3. That is not true. They are very different. Overall, when we would average the data, they would tend to be pretty accurate as to what we were seeing overall. But some days you might have a sensory panel that has more people that tend to score on the higher side. So that can just skew your data a little bit. Kind of in hindsight, I don't really know a great way to train on that scale unless you had standards, some sort of hop standards. So eventually we got into getting those more thorough descriptions. So we sat down with a group of 4 or 5 of us, quality, head brewer, a couple other brewers, I think the owner was involved, and just tasted through several different batches of the same beer. So we went through our core beers one at a time and really came up with solid descriptions of those beers. Then we trained the staff on that. This is an example of our lager. This is our IPA. And just, what are the true to type descriptions for that beer? What are faults for that particular beer? So it might be that it's not a fault for that style of beer, but for our beer, maybe a little bit of sweetness in the finish is acceptable for that style, but not for our beer. So that would be a fault if that beer had some of that sweetness. Then we went to a more simple form, so we kind of did the pass-fail for different attributes. So we did pass-fail for, aroma, appearance, flavor, taste, mouthfeel, and overall. So this was nice because sometimes you could fail for one attribute, but not the beer overall. So maybe the aroma was a little bit muted, so not quite what it could be. But everything else might be fine with the beer. Maybe the beer is very recognizable as the brand, and that's kind of, the big thing here. Does it hit that true to target profile? Are your customers going to notice it at all? But we can still use that data. So, in this case, we had 1 fail for aroma. I wouldn't worry about that. If we had 15 fails for aroma, then, maybe if 50% of the people at the panel are failing for aroma, we would then want to go look into that batch of beer. So what happened with this beer? Maybe we just switched to a new lot of hops. So, maybe that kind of answers the question. Maybe that beer sat in a tank for a long time over a holiday weekend, or, maybe somebody added the wrong hops or didn't set the glycol tank correctly, or there's plenty of things that can happen in the brewery that can affect the flavor of the beer. So you can go back and use that data and then make changes. How do you prevent this from happening next time? So that pass-fail worked well for us. We eventually moved to Draft Labs, which works very similar. Again, that same kind of pass-fail. And then they also have this description builder built right into the app. So for new beers, seasonal beers, we could just use that and kind of build that description, and then take the time to make sure that we trained everybody on that beer, what it was supposed to taste like, what the flavors they were looking for were, and go from there. All right.
Thanks.
Your panel.
Oh yeah, my panel. We started, before I got there, Industrial Arts used Draft Lab. So when I got there, I used a lot of Draft Lab data to basically build out our core brand descriptions. That program is really good at aggregating data and making it easy to turn into words or beer descriptions. So that's where I started, and then before that, we we didn't brew a ton of variation in style, but then we started brewing new beers every 2 weeks. So we had all these new beers that needed descriptions. So that's when I kind of started training the staff on what I was referring to as a descriptive analysis. So just making sure everyone is utilizing the same evaluation method. So standardizing that evaluation method across your staff is huge, because obviously if you're tasting and evaluating the beer differently, you're going to get different outcomes. So that helped us build and evolve a lot of our beer descriptions. And then we've also turned into using these true to type tastings. They were very helpful for scale up to our new production facility in Beacon. The water was very different, and we leaned on those heavily during those scale ups. And I think we sold every single batch of beer. I'm sorry. I think we dumped maybe 2 batches of wrench, and aside from that, we were able to validate through sensory and sell every other core brand batch of beer that we brewed at Beacon, so that was very helpful. And now with our NA product that we're pasteurizing, NA requires heavy pasteurization. As you all may or may not know, we've kind of turned our focus now more towards evaluating age characteristics and cook characteristics from pasteurizing not beer, or as we call it, cereal beverage, or as the TTB calls it. So that's where our focus is now, but building upon like all those descriptive analysis and true to type tastings kind of gave our staff a little more confidence to kind of step in to do those tastings, which I feel like is a big part of sensory. And you see it anytime we have a new hire and we're like, hey, we're doing this tasting, come. They're like, I don't know how to do this. And I guess like that's kind of the beautiful thing about sensories. There's really no wrong answers. There's specific methods we use, and we want to make sure our vernacular and our verbiage is all consistent and the same so we can know what each other are saying. But I can't tell any one of you what you're tasting or smelling. So yeah. That's kind of how our sensory program evolved.
All right, and that's, kind of that, you don't know what other people are tasting and smelling. So again, for that kind of group, when you are talking about beers together, doing like a group training, everybody's got this one attribute, or whether it's just your beer, like, okay, and it has this flavor, this is how we're gonna describe it together. All right, we've got a bunch of reasons why it's a good idea to start a panel. We've talked a lot about our flavor consistency. Of course, customers are becoming more and more, they're expecting that flavor consistency more and more. Another thing is just to generate those brand descriptions. So, we internally at Zero Gravity needed that to, be able to fill out our forms and to have those solid descriptions. But it's also great to have, just for your consumers too. So, for marketing or just for your staff, like in the tap room, to be describing the beer. So if they're, describing the beers in a consistent way, that's going to help your consumers as well. For R&D, if you are a new brewery and, trying to dial in some of your recipes, you can use a sensory panel to, really figure out what you like, what you don't like, compare different batches to each other. If you're doing different locations, making sure you've got that flavor profile. The ASBC, the American Society of Brewing Chemists, they have tons of resources on sensory, and they have a whole bunch of different methods of analysis. So you can do, triangle tests and duo trios. We're not going to get into that today, but just know that there are other ways to do, that more involves statistical analysis of your beers, and is this different from this beer or not. For troubleshooting, so if there's a problem in the brew house, even if it's just that hop intensity that's low, or if there's some sort of an off flavor, you can go back to the brew house and, figure out, okay, what happened here? How do we prevent that? How do we make sure it doesn't happen again? To be able to do that troubleshooting, you first have to be able to identify those off flavors. So off flavor training is an important part of this too. There's certainly off flavor spike kits that you can get from all over. You can get, just different flavor compounds. You can get vinegar from the grocery store and, train on some of that. Sigma Aldrich has a line of food grade flavors that you can get to spike beers and, find what is important to your brewery. There's even some that are like specific, like malt flavors and stuff, so you can, or if you do a lot of like barrel aging, what are those flavors that you're looking for, and you can train specifically on those and making sure that you're hitting those or that you're avoiding ones that you don't want. We talked about matching flavor profiles. You're in process for product release, so you could have often a true to type sensory panel is going to be easiest if you're having finished products, cans of beer, but you also obviously want to be having the beers throughout the process. I know some breweries, when they're doing their gravity checks, they're sampling the beer from the fermenter. The sooner you catch something that doesn't seem quite right, the sooner you can fix it. Or maybe if it's too far gone, you can at least save yourself all the effort of dry hopping and packaging the beer and all that associated cost. So you can have some of those formal or informal sessions throughout the process. Maybe before beer is packaged, you're doing some sort of sensory, or before it's moved to another tank. If you are not making the same beers over and over again, not everybody needs that flavor consistency because they're making different beers all the time. You can have a sensory panel that is checking if that beer is ready to be released. So maybe you've got a barrel program, maybe you're doing some blending, do your sensory for that to see what barrels you want to use, if you want to blend things. If you've got any wild beers, is that beer ready to be released? Is it at its peak? What else we got here? Style guidelines, we talked about that. And then that vocab. So having that common vocab so you know exactly what your coworkers are talking about or your customers is really helpful.
I also wanted to touch a bit on in-process and package product release. As I'm assuming a lot of people in here are brewers or work on the production floor, it is very important for your production staff to be familiar with your true to type descriptions, so they can maybe not do a full evaluation, but anytime you're moving a beer through a centrifuge or post filtration or pre-package, those are all points in the process where they should be checking in with your beer and assuring that it's true to type, right? Like, each step in the process is maybe another risk of contamination, or it costs money to move stuff into a package or move stuff through a centrifuge, or labor to just even move beer from tank to tank. So if there is a problem, you want to catch it as early as possible.
And you might think like with some of these, like if there is a little difference that like, oh, I'm going to remember that, if you're a small brewery maybe, but just have a Google form. It's so easy. It, can automatically send to a Google sheet. So you have that data. So you can like look back on it. We can also experience palate drift. So if there's like very slight changes in the process or the beer, you might not notice, kind of these subtle changes. But if you've got that data to go back to, that can be really helpful there. So just, a little bit on sensory goals. We're not going to get kind of too far into it. Don't do everything all at once. You're going to burn yourself out. So often, when you start a sensory panel, it's all like, oh yeah, let's do off-flavor training, and we're going to get all the spike kits, and we're going to learn all that. But really, that true to type description or that true to brand description is where you should start. And I mean, depending on your sensory goals and what you want to do with your data and what you're looking for with your brewery. But try to focus on one thing at a time. Once you feel really comfortable with that, then you can move on to something else. So once you've trained on those true to type descriptions, then get into off-flavor training, because that is still very important for your brewery and being able to identify if you have anything else going on. Set kind of those big goals and then break them down into more manageable so you don't burn yourself out. It might be your first goal is just to get people to come to sensory and, have people get in the habit of that. Coming once a week or twice a week, depending on your production schedule or how you set up your panel. And also know that your sensory panel, your program is going to change over time. As your brewery grows and evolves, so too is your panel. You're going to have different things that you're looking for. You're going to end up having different goals, and that's okay. You don't have to have, everything planned out exactly before you start. Just kind of get into it and evolve.
Yeah, I mean, your sensory program probably should be evolving always, just like beers and the industry and everything. Using sensory panel to extend shelf life. We didn't really, did you touch
No,
on
I
it?
didn't.
It's pretty important too. I mean, to us, that's money, right? Like we buy our beer back at its shelf life. So maybe extending that a month or sending out a survey to your wholesalers to say, hey, do you cold store our package? Testing the difference between warm and cold store. I'll tell you what, it always lasts better at cold store. But I mean, just doing those tests and knowing how your beer reacts to those different conditions and knowing the conditions in which your beer sits in through its life cycle can really help you make an informed decision on how long you want it to sit on a shelf, or what's an acceptable date range for your product. Any questions on anything? Cool. Or we can wait to the end. Oh, you want? Cool.
I just had a question about Draft Labs. I attended one of your seminars a few years ago, and I've since gotten your phone. To be honest with you, I've got to download it. Is that something?
We don't work for Geoff Labs. We've just been shamelessly plugging.
We just like it.
Well, that's what I was wondering, because you referenced the Google
Form.
survey form, but not. I was just curious about Draft Labs, if you're here or anything.
I mean, other than, why are you gonna leave if we say no?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, not specifically. Other than some. I mean, we do have a slide on the pros. On some
It
of the
tends
pros.
to be like what your program will evolve into. Most brewers that I know, you start with the free version with Google Forms, and that works great. If you're really good at working with Google Sheets and like looking at the data, that's going to work for you for a long time. But often you upgrade to Draft Labs. I think the basic subscription is $50 a month, so it's really affordable. And it's a lot easier to organize and look at your data and add new products and things like that.
We do have a slide on that and like some pros and cons of like a form versus Draft Labs. That's a good question. So yeah, panel setup. Excuse me. Getting started and maintaining your panel. I'm guessing a lot of people here have a staff smaller than 20. How many more than 20? 30, 40? One.
I don't know the kitchen.
Better than none.
I mean, any member of your team should be considered a panelist if you have them. The more people you can train on how to properly taste and evaluate beer, the more impactful your panel data would be. Don't be intimidated, right? We all have to start somewhere, and we only have the people we have on our team. So, I know there's like a lot of big breweries with huge panels, that's just not feasible for everyone. So I don't think any of us should be intimidated that we have, a panel of 10 people. That's all who works there. But just making sure to incentivize other members of your organization, whether they work in the office or work in your tasting room or, cook or, bus tables, getting them involved as well can be really beneficial and really help out with data.
I have a question about that exactly. I have a sensory panel. We use Draft Labs. There's 5 of us now in the production team. We use it, but I tried to get all of our staff, the taproom staff, to start doing well. And we'll pay you, come hang out, you can drink beer, but we had a hard time getting most of the other staff to be interested or to take time out of their day or whatever. So are there other ways you can incentivize, or that you personally incentivize staff outside of the production?
I find like a little bit of training and like a discussion. I think a lot of people outside the production part of a brewery are very intimidated to come and sit and taste beer with the production team.
Yeah.
So, I mean, just very generally, any way you can make them feel more comfortable in that space, I think will help them want to be more involved. And any like kind of educational tools you can give them to make them feel like they're learning something about this process is huge.
Also snacks.
Snacks help. Snacks help.
Yeah, no, that was definitely my biggest thing, was just getting people to come. You want as many people as you can get, but you don't want to force people. If you're making people come, you're not going to get good data. They don't want to be there. You know, they're not going to, put their all into it. Yeah, definitely that training and people feeling like comfortable, confident with that. And, I know some people will do like point systems too. You could, for swag, or have a pizza party if everybody comes, or, all sorts of, yeah. Did you have a?
I was even just going to add, you mentioned that you're Cicerone certified, and like craft bar that I worked at, that I think we met at, they tried to get everybody beer server certified, and just like knowledge is power. And I think that intimidation factor you're talking about, like the more information that you can give to your staff, the more empowered they're going to feel, and the less intimidated they're going to feel walking in.
Yeah, and also just like thanking people and like showing them that like you really appreciate them. Show them what you're doing with the data too. So, Draft Labs is nice because you get nice pretty bar graphs and stuff with your data. You can make that, with Google Sheets too. But yeah, making sure that you're letting people know like, this is important data, and this is how we're using the data to make decisions about the brewery. Yeah, and so at Zero Gravity, we eventually we were only packaging about 4 different brands a week, so because we were getting bigger tanks, and so we kept the 2-day-a-week one, and we would have one day was true to type sensory panel, and then the other day was just an educational piece. And so some days it would be training on a particular brand of beer, some days it would be looking at different ages of beer, some day I didn't prepare things in time, and I would just grab 4 beers off of the 10-tap system and see if people could guess what they are. Blind tasting is a lot of fun when you have no context. You'll be surprised that you can't pick out your own beers. So you can also, if you are very small, get some of your customers involved, some of your loyal customers. Just know that if you are going to use customers, that data is going to be more of that liking data, not necessarily, they're not going to be, you're not going to be able to train all your customers on the true to type. So just make sure that you're using that data, as you well, knowing that it's just more of that customer preference data that you're getting there. Should we keep going with the
And go in the who.
the who, what, when, why?
W's.
Yeah, so when you're, planning out your panel, just, basically go through the who, what, when, why, where, how. Start with your why. Why do you want to start your panel? Because that's going to, dictate what you're having at your panel. Is it that consistency, or are you doing some sort of off-flavor training or anything like that? Who's going to be in your panel? Invite everybody. We already talked a bunch about that. Even just to think about what time of day are you going to do it? You don't want it to be, a time of day that people, are really busy. Mid-morning seems to work well. Before people have had lunch, ideally nobody's eating or drinking a half hour before sensory. That can affect your palate and how you're experiencing the different beers. And people aren't too busy in their day yet. So that if you're doing it in a tasting room, so again, ideally, there's a lot of ideals here when you are running a panel, but we work in breweries and we have to work with what we have. So you're going to want, a clean, well-lit room that's free from odors, and you've got plenty of space and plenty of light. We don't all have that. If you have a tap room, that tends to be a nice place to have a panel. You've got, tables, chairs, glassware, hopefully a dishwasher, things like that. That's also where your customer is, evaluating your beers too. So if you are doing it in a panel or in a tasting room like that, the time of day that you can do it will be dependent on that. So you're going to have to do it before they open. You also don't want to do it right when the kitchen's opening. If you have a kitchen attached, that's going to have a lot of odors that can interfere.
No chopping onions and then evaluating beer. It's a big no-no.
And then, what are you going to be evaluating? Is it finished beer? Is it beer in process? Maybe you're getting bright tanks, maybe raw ingredients. Depending on the goals of your sensory panel, you're going to be looking at different things, maybe different aged products, and then getting into the how, like how are you collecting your data? Are you using your Google Forms? Are you using Draft Labs or something else? And kind of it all goes back to that, like, okay, why are you collecting this data? What are you going to be using it for? You cover everything?
Next slide.
Yeah.
Okay, so I just wanted to touch a little bit on off-flavor and attribute training. This is a attribute sheet I stole from my last job, which had a great sensory program. Kudos, New Belgium. But they did a really good job of taking the attributes or off flavors, because one beer's attribute is another beer's off flavor, right? And kind of describing where you get it, like, everyone smells everything a little bit different. So, like, one interesting one is like ethyl butyrate, strong tropical fruit, Hawaiian punch, juicy fruit gum, slight bile and puke. So like people smell and perceive these things much differently at different concentrations. So kind of learning those is very helpful to troubleshoot a production problem or just kind of evaluate your beers overall. And keeping track of, if you are going to do some off-flavor and attribute training, keeping track of who is sensitive to what is highly important too. Like at the panel at New Belgium, you couldn't even get on the taste panel unless you were validated on 16 attributes. And like anosmia, we all have heard of anosmia since COVID came out, but that's been a real thing in beer forever. Like I'm sure there's brewers at this conference that are anosmic to diacetyl, and I'm sure they're anosmic to acetaldehyde. People just can't smell certain things. It's just genetic. So that's just like one of the best reasons I can point to have a extensive sensory panel. You in the blue vest.
If you are able to identify people who are nose blind to something, do you treat their data differently? Do you put an asterisk by it? I don't know.
Well, yeah, if they say they smell diacetyl, but they've never picked up diacetyl in a training, that should be a red flag.
Like if you're doing a general sensor, if you're doing a general panel and they're filling out information across the spectrum, but they have identified weaknesses in some areas, you throw an asterisk by it, or do you just kind of lump it in except for the things you identify?
I guess it depends on the situation. Like if you're evaluating for a specific thing, yes. Like if this person is anosmic to something and you know through your data that they can't perceive it, but then they do a tasting and tell you like, this beer has this, and you're like, you don't really know that. So, yeah, I guess like putting an asterisk would be a good point.
Data points you have, the better. So if you have 10 people and 8 are saying there's diacetyl in it and 2 are saying there's not, and you know that one of them can't taste it, then you have a problem.
The evaluation method. Do you want me to do this? Cool. So yeah, as I mentioned earlier, standardizing your evaluation method is highly important to keep everyone smelling, tasting, seeing, hearing, everything consistently. This is the evaluation method we use. The first 2 being visual, like using your visual attributes. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, using your aroma attributes. All of these things you pick up different stuff. And like the one example I want to give is like with the distance method. I never picked up DMS until I started using this method because these sulfur compounds are highly volatile, and if you just go in, you just blow out your sensory receptors so you don't smell it. Same with the 1 and 2 second sniff and diacetyl. It's just easier to pick up different compounds using different methods. But I think the most crucial thing is that everyone's using the same method, or else your data is just different, right? For the guy in the front, sensory software. This is something I think we've both used. That is highly helpful. I think like I mentioned at the beginning, it makes it really easy to aggregate your data. It makes it really simple to find descriptors. But it all depends on like how much time you have. Like you don't need a dedicated person to sensory. With Draft Labs, that kind of is your sensory person. It does cost a little bit of money, but it's relatively cheap. And they do have a consumer-facing portion called Sample Locks that we used in my presentation yesterday, which can be very beneficial for knowing what your customer likes and kind of integrating that data into your sensory panel. Do you have anything else to touch on that?
Well, I guess just like a lot of, sensory is kind of what you put into it is what you're going to get out of it. So, you can do it, very cheaply. If you don't have a big budget, you can do Google Forms. You're going to have to spend a lot of time, setting things up and training things, or you can, spend a lot of money on off-flavor kits and software. But, it's really, what you put into it is what you're going to get out of it, whether that's time or money or energy. So just something to think about.
Yeah, and then the Google form,
Yeah,
which
let's make
we
a
all
Google form.
just utilized. It's easy to use. It's free. Everyone uses Google, right? Is there anyone in here that doesn't use Google? Bing, you're a Bing person? Yeah, okay. Okay, Bill Gates. So, and this, we already evaluated the beer, so we're kind of on to questions. One of you mentioned wanting to see how easy it was to make a Google form. So I'll just do that up here real quick.
It's nice because everybody's, got their phones. At Magic had, so long ago, we had like paper and pens that we would like fill out our forms. And but then I never entered the data into Excel because that was annoying. But, now everybody, you can just fill it out on your phone and then go to your Excel sheet, yeah.
So are there any benefits to handwriting, or does it just become more data entry that doesn't happen?
To me, it was just data entry that didn't happen. There might be other people who enjoy data entry, and that might be a different story.
Let me see my form list, I'm sorry.
Sometimes you can do
This is
like
how many
the
forms
spider,
I have for sensory.
plots, which might be easier to do by hand, but then again, entering that data is complicated.
Boom, okay. Sensory,
I think I know the thing.
do it.
Yeah, this is all you need.
What kind of question? So this is what I did for the one you did. I did a multiple choice grid. Pass. Spelled correctly.
It even like suggests fail. You don't even have to type it in.
Fail. And then it was what? Visual. Blah. Blah. Blah.
Once more.
And then you can add a comment, like a separate one if you want to do a comment section. So if anybody's failing for
It doesn't let me-
anything.
I can't use it twice.
Lot two.
Log out. And then, like, that's it. And then you can obviously just add more questions.
And if you
Oh,
want
I
to do
want this to be-
scales,
I want this to be a paragraph. What's the question? Describe why you picked this. And then you could just go look, and then, like, that's your form. I mean, it's pretty easy. And then it aggregates your responses here. You can link it to a Google Sheet to store your data. I mean, sorry, Draft Labs, but but yeah, that's just kind of what we used once we had a dedicated sensory person and myself. I think we stopped using Draft Labs during COVID because we just kind of put a pause on sensory because no one really knew how contagious everyone was. And then I just kind of moved into using Google Forms and building forms myself. Questions? What do I pick? Nikki.
Can you talk a little bit about your sensory libraries and how you started to build them and how you choose samples to actually put on a panel?
Yeah, I can speak on that a little bit. So that's a twofold question for me right now because with our NA product, we're making a food product essentially. So I just have to store multiple cases of those samples throughout like various pasteurization units for health and safety data, for if we have any issues, and then also for aging sensory tests. But then for our core beers, I'm typically grabbing, let's just say half a case from each packaging run. Like, wrench we package 3 times a week. So every 2 or 3 weeks I'll grab wrench. But for other brands that we don't package as much, I'll just grab one each time. I store half of it in warm storage and then half of it in cold storage. And then I kind of evolved it from there. So for instance, like it was very obvious that our IPA at 3 months warm store was just poop. So what I started doing was like, okay, well let me do a 1 month cold store and then 2 month warm store. Because like, we're gonna sit on it for a couple weeks before we send it to distro. And then once it hits distro, we don't really know. So we gotta just count on it being warm store. With like our hazy IPAs, it was pretty obvious at 3 months warm. That was it, like it was done. So yeah, I just kind of I started at the 2 extremes and then just started like kind of dialing into different storage conditions from there. Does that answer your question?
It's like a good way to get started, like a general rubric or something to start with, because I feel like the past span you guys give us, like the century already been established, like you already put the terms that you kind of want to put on your beer description, so like it's a way to kind of like work backwards to arrive at those with your staff. So like any basic forms of rubrics you can start with.
I mean, I had done the BJCP certification, years ago. So that was kind of when I first started evaluating beers. That's a nonprofit organization. Those evaluation forms that they use for like homebrew competitions are, you can just print one of those off, and they just kind of walk you through. Those are more based on style guidelines. So you do have to, I would first take the time to come up with that description. So the brewer or whoever, what is an example of that beer? But yeah, I would use that kind of as a guide. And also the BJCP style guidelines can be a helpful guide too, if you're not necessarily great at describing beers, which I am not. So I kind of like to use those as a guide. I also like to compare things too. I think sometimes that's easier for me to say, this has a pine aroma because I know that this one doesn't. So maybe it doesn't jump out to me unless I'm comparing it to something else. So I don't know. I guess it's what works for you, and different people are gonna maybe different ways.
Draft Labs was very helpful with that too,
Yes.
because the way the tastings are set up there, they use the flavor map that makes it very easy for a taster to go through and select things. And like I said, like that's how I generated that wrench description, was from Draft Lab data that we had gained previously, and kind of used recent data to amend it, but that was very helpful in like being like, okay, here are the 5 key things that people tend to smell, and this is how bitter people, you still have to kind of take it and interpret it to write a description, right? But it was very helpful at aggregating data.
And another really nice thing with the Draft Labs, like the flavor descriptions are...
Do we get a commission?
They don't, they're not just all like right in front of your face, so you kind of first have to like find the flavor, instead of being influenced by it, so if you're like, oh, I'm getting a lot of mango out of this, then you have to be like, okay, that's fruit. You click on the fruit, and then the different types of fruit. Is it a berry? Is it tropical fruit or something? So that's another nice thing, that it's not just like all right there. You have to kind of actually experience the flavor first, and then you can click it.
Has your team ever done any research on like the difference between like using hot cryo and hot sauce and the longevity of that in packaging versus just using regular T90 pellets per se that you make with beer with a bunch of cryo? Does it last longer on the shelf in those conditions like you're saying. And, you know, because I feel like every time I've used cryo or one of those products, it seems to last a little bit longer and more reliable on the shelf.
We haven't done any specific research on that or sensory studies on that.
Yeah.
To me, that makes, as a brewer, makes a lot of sense because there's less vegetal material in there.
Yeah.
But no, I can't definitively say whether or not.
The high alpha acids gives it more of that fruit and tropical content.
Could be, that's a decent hypothesis, I think.
Go with it.
But like, I don't have any data to back that
Come
up.
up with an experiment
Yeah.
and
Hit up YCH, I'm sure they have something to tell you. Did you have a question in the back?
Oh, yeah. I was wondering about if you had any recommendations for how to set up a panel in order with different styles.
Like evaluating different styles at once?
Well, like the order to set up the panel in between like 4 or 5 beers. You should start with like a lighter beer and work towards a darker, an IPA.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
for sure.
I-
And don't do like too many beers in one time. So if you're, 4 beers is probably good. If you have like 6, you might want to split it against like 2 panels.
Okay.
If you have 3 wrenches back to back, they're either all going to start to taste the same, or maybe, that first one. A lot of places will do like a control beer before they even start sensory, because a lot of times that first one has like, whoa, that's like a great hop aroma, and then the second one you're like, oh, it's not so, but it's, because you're a little desensitized to it already. Did that answer the question?
Did that
Did I
get you?
stop?
Did that?
Okay.
Thanks. It's perfect that you said exactly. I had a follow-up question. What are ideal methods for palate cleansing if you do sit down with a panel of multiple beers to be able to assess it properly?
I mean, I would just usually have water between. I didn't really think I had to have, yeah, you could have like unsalted saltines.
Coffee beans. No, that's real. Like you smell coffee beans to kind of clear your aroma.
Another thing too is just like smelling like your hand or like, your shoulder. Something that's like not the beer.
We're happy for you.
We can tell whether that.
I've gone as far as like when I find percentages for barrel blends, I have special space in the morning because I overthink it that much, the sense of time.
Yeah.
It's too big.
No, and I know like, beer competitions, they have unscented hand soap and, so you don't want to be around, different flavors. Those can definitely influence, your perception of those flavors. Yeah, and so it's like, your brain has like told you that you don't need to like worry about that flavor, like everything's safe, like you don't, so it stops like giving you sensors for these new, flavor. I'm, not doing a good job explaining this right now, but different, aromas, your brain's like, oh, like, do I need to worry about this? Is this danger? Like when you walk into a coffee shop, it smells like coffee, and then 2 minutes later you don't notice it.
Like when you take a poop and you're like, oh, now it doesn't smell anymore. Come on, everyone poops, right? I mean, got a poop choke? Okay.
I have 2 of them. Do you have any thoughts on doing sensory side by side with the same beer packaged on the same day, perhaps from draft versus in cans? Or like do you draw a line? Well, theoretically from draft and from the cans, it should be the same thing, but
I'd be
and like in my experience, if I have something out of a bright tank, it tastes way different than if I just pour it out of a can. But that could just be me subjective to.
I mean, I'd be more interested to see those side by side after a month or 2 months or 3 months. But yeah, I mean, you're losing different levels of carbonation. There's different levels of oxygen ingress. There are definitely some differences there. I think detecting those differences day one would be tough, but like over time, I think would be a more impactful study.
Because there's a lot of, if you're doing like a triangle test, people are just looking for differences, even like just temperature, so it could have nothing to do with like the flavor. There's just this other thing that they're noticing that you don't necessarily know, like why they're saying they can tell a difference. Yeah, and also the carbonation is a big thing. So are you going, directly from can to glass and draft to glass, or are you doing draft into a pitcher and then you're pouring into a glass, and like the foam level can, you know, be a little bit different, and sometimes people, you know, pick up on that. So
I mean, real quick too, here's a triangle test I did recently that I presented on it yesterday. Oh no, hold on. Oh no. It's 3 o'clock, we gotta go. But here you can see, these are the same, oh, what are you doing? I swear I'm not a boomer. Apologies to any boomers in the room. You can see here, like I did a wrench test with two different wrenches, and even these two identical samples, same cans of beer packaged within seconds of each other, we got variation from the same panel. So like, if people are looking for a difference, they will find it. I wouldn't call it statistically significant, but like, that's just a point, like, people will find a difference because they think it's different. So yeah. Anything else? One more question.
Yeah, are there any concerns with true to target or true to brand tests that when someone has a description in front of them, they'll kind of get blinders on and only look for those characteristics and potentially miss something else? And if there is a concern for that, how do you work around that or address that?
I think that comes down to training your panel and like practice, really. Because you're right, like if you see the description and it's like orange, you're like, oh, you're thinking about orange. But I mean, the only way to mitigate that, I think, is training your panel to just like be aware of those implicit biases.
don't you sometimes not tell people?
I do. I mean, when I do a descriptive analysis tasting, I'll do it blind so people don't know what it is. But it's hard to do a true to type panel without telling them what it is, because what do they have to base it against?
And also, when your customers are drinking their beer, they're not like, I mean, some of them are, but not all of them are like going through and like evaluating it, and you know, like, so we're putting more into it, you know, at our sensory panels, and you know, a lot of stuff, it's like, well, we're noticing this because we try this beer every day and we are trained to look for these differences, but your customer's not doing that, and they're not, you know, going, you know, 2 different batches side by side, so you get a little leeway there.
I got some more time if anyone wants to talk to me outside. Thank you all.